Nick Reiner comes up Gemini rising. His ruler, Mercury, sits in the fifth with no aspects whatsoever. He did nothing with his life. He had no aspirations, no hobbies, no interests. All he wanted to do was immerse himself in recreational drugs. Look at Venus opposing Saturn along the parental 4th and 10th cusps. There's a problem bonding with his parents. The relationship with his father was cold and distant. Although Rob Reiner, his father, made overtures to try to normalize their relationship, Nick simply wasn't having it. Nick was a troublesome child to raise due to his adolescent rages. He started doing drugs when he was 14. By the time he was 15, he was going in and out of rehab until he left home at 19, preferring to be on the streets than give up drugs. He was homeless for over 3 years. He ate out of garbage cans, slept in abandoned buildings, and when necessary, took menial work to score drugs. Nick's poison of choice was marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and meth, all the usual suspects. Gemini rising is highly perceptive, and it's not lost on Nick that Rob had feelings of guilt on how Nick turned out. How is he going to make it in life? How is he going to compete for jobs? Rob believed Nick was incapable of supporting himself due to his drug addiction, and perhaps there was mental illness. So guilt-ridden Rob believes he's responsible for keeping his impaired son safe. It becomes taken for granted by all that Nick was never going to amount to anything because of his drug use and rages. As a responsible father, Rob can't have his son roaming the streets, so he gives Nick free room and board in the guest house to give him time to straighten out. And so the charade begins. I believe Nick fed off his father's feelings of guilt to induce his father to support him. What started out as an errant youth leaving home to evade rehab was parlayed into Nick freeloading off his parents. Nick was nothing more than a crafty, old-fashioned con artist, and he pulled that off for a decade. Rob used his clout to get Nick work gigs, even creating an internship on the series Family Guy, where Nick worked between 3 to 6 months. Co-workers said Nick was not a hard worker and did not work hard. He often spent company time kibitzing with other co-workers. Typical of Gemini rising, Nick liked to talk. He was interviewed on Dopey Podcast a number of times where he would talk about his drug addiction and homelessness. Nick described a time when he tried to fool his parents he had mental illness to get drugs. Did his perceptive Gemini rising self notice that acting like he had mental illness opened up doors for him? Rob Reiner's public chart, which absolutely rectifies in spades, shows the water sign Scorpio rising. Water signs rising are soft-hearted pushovers. Yes, even Scorpio, particularly regarding family. Rob's ruler, Mars, along with his Sun and Mercury, are also in a water sign Pisces. He also has Jupiter in the water sign Scorpio. When you have so much water in the chart, just multiply it all out. Rob was a colossal, soft-hearted pushover, and he was putty in the hands of crafty, conniving, Gemini rising Nick. Nick played the role of a lifetime, passing himself off as an impaired, special needs person, incapable of supporting himself, and yet he was capable of living off the streets for over 3 years. Every now and then, Nick would fly into one of his rages, totally unrestrained, unleashing himself to keep the con going, perhaps? Something he wouldn't dare do on the streets, or he'd get beaten up. He duped his father into believing he knew better how to overcome addiction than the professionals, while the experts were telling Rob Nick was lying.
The parent your main job is to keep your child safe. So I would do anything. I felt at a loss, so I would do anything that, as we say in the film, anybody with a desk and a diploma, I would listen to them, and the whole idea of tough love and you have to be a certain way, and it's not my nature, it's not the way I am built, but I went and did that. And I think that, at the end of the day, I know my child better than an expert does, and I probably should have trusted my own instinct.
He suckered Rob at every turn. He would blame his father for forcing him on the streets. He would blame his father and grandfather that he couldn't hope to measure up to their success, that he was living under their shadow, even though he never cared about a career before. Nick put the blame on others, distracting attention away from his own lazy self. Then he would brag about how he could get away with anything, how he trashed the guest house while on drugs, tried to feign mental illness to get meds, vandalized a church window to prove he was crazy, duped his father into believing he knew better than the experts on how to kick drug addiction.
The way I got Wellbutrin is actually really fun. I was at Alina Lodge, and I don't know if I told this last week, but they refused to give me meds. So to prove I was crazy, because they were like, you don't need any meds.
Yeah,
and I was like freaking out. And I was like, you don't think I need meds? And they're like, yeah, we think you're just all up to an act here, and this is all just fake. And I said, okay. And then I went back to, the Roost. Remember the Roost?
No.
That's what they called the little barracks.
Okay.
And I was like, how do I show these mother and I'm crazy?
Yeah.
So I was like, I'll throw a rock through a window.
Yeah.
So I started and they have this thing there that they love. That little church. It's not a church really.
Yeah.
It's like
they were building that when I was there.
It's like a meeting room that is like has these big glass windows, and they loved it, and they always were like, Mrs. Delaney was here when they built this, and I hated that whole thing. So I took a rock and I started on the path, and I was going up this hill, and my friend Peter's like, where are you going, man? And I was like, can't talk right now, just got to do this. Yeah. And I went and I threw the rock through the window, and some woman saw me, and she ratted on me, and then they put me on Wellbutrin.
What a coward Nick is. And the crowning glory of mischievous achievement was in Being Charlie, a movie Rob and Nick made together, tightly connected to Nick's life. In the end, the villainous successful father apologizes to his parasitic, vandalizing, car-stealing, medicine cabinet filching, pill-popping, drug addict son, that useless blob of protoplasm living off his father's largesse. Rob tells all in an interview that he apologized to his son after making the movie. But look at Nick's chart. He has a stellium of planets in the fifth. He easily could have been an actor. He had those smoldering good looks. In fact, all the siblings took after their mother's good looks. More importantly, he was Hollywood connected. He would be put at the head of the line. How do you think Rob Reiner got his role as Mike Stivic on All in the Family? So Nick was in if he was willing to go for it. It would have been handed to him on a silver platter. But he opted for his Sun, Moon, and Venus in the fourth instead, to freeload off his parents. Rob had been giving Nick a $10,000 monthly allowance. That's $120,000 a year for doing nothing, plus the guest house, plus his expenses paid by his father. Why would this give Nick incentive to want to work? Apparently, Rob never considered he could be fueling Nick's drug habit. Living by his wits, Nick could keep the freeloading ruse going until his parents died off, and he could collect his inheritance. He would then be home free. Fast forward to the fall of 2025. Nick was no longer the endearing, good-looking youth Rob was bending over backwards to bond with. He was now an aging, thuggish-looking, weight-gaining, middle-aged man whose drug habit had run amok. Because of Nick's increasingly erratic behavior, Rob no longer wanted him on the compound. Rob told his friends he was petrified of his son, believed his son could do him harm. The cops were called to the Reiners' home 6 times since 2013. On the day of Conan O'Brien's annual Christmas party, Rob, as usual, dragged Nick to it because he didn't trust his son on the home compound by himself. Nick was known to steal from his parents. Nick may have deliberately humiliated Ron in front of his A-lister friends in an effort to manipulate his father to stop bringing him to these events, especially now that those charming good looks were gone and he had put on weight. He was losing his hair and beginning to look more like Rob. Clearly, he no longer fit in. In this group picture for a Spinal Tap sequel, Nick's big body sticks out like a sore thumb. He had been sporting a huge frown ever since gaining weight. It was likely torture for Nick to be doing these photo shoots, as if he was being put on display to be gawked at. We don't know the missing piece to the puzzle as what led Nick to murder his parents. One would guess the catalyst would be his father kicking him off the property. The manipulation backfired. Apparently he can't get away with everything after all. Perhaps in his drug-addled state, Nick thought he could get away with the murders to fast-track his inheritance. But I'm going to leave it here. Thanks for watching.